It's a pleasure for me here to be with you today to launch our third speaker in our series, Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Learning, organized in collaboration with the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance, CSLP, Concordia, and McGill University. My name is Jihan Rabah, manager of the CSLP. I would begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on indigenous lands. Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. I will now give you a small introduction about the CSLP. Do you know about the CSLP? The mission of the CSLP at Concordia University is to research teaching and learning processes. We currently have about 45 faculty members and various undergraduate and graduate student members who have developed unique pedagogical expertise working with community organizations, school boards, policymaking bodies, and social health service providers. Our center's overall focus is to develop evidence-based tools and strategies that would positively impact our society. One of the center's development priorities is to support the transfer of knowledge to practice settings. For us, this speaker series is one way we are hoping to achieve this objective and reach out to several educators, public policy representatives, school counselors, researchers, and administrators of educational institutions. Welcome to all of you. Our presenter today, whom our esteemed CSLP member, Professor McDonough, will introduce in a few minutes, will have 45 minutes for her presentation. A period of questions and answers will follow. Kindly write your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Please indicate if you would like to be called upon to ask your question directly, or otherwise we will be happy to ask it on your behalf. We will try to handle as much as possible, hopefully all of the questions. The question period will begin as soon as our speaker is done with the presentation. Finally, please note that we are recording the presentation today. The conference recording will be available on the center's website and social media pages in the coming weeks. It gives me great pleasure to give the floor now to Professor McDonough to introduce our speaker for today. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jihan. Yeah, my name is Kevin McDonough from the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University, and it's a genuinely great pleasure to be able to introduce Ashley Taylor and her talk today. Ashley and I met, I think, almost 10 years ago. So fortuitously, we were on a plane sitting next to each other on the way to the same conference, and we ended up striking up a conversation about her work and our shared interest in the education of students with intellectual disabilities and philosophical issues related to that. We've continued that conversation over the course of the last 10 years or so, and recently started writing some things together, and I owe her a great debt, and I've learned a lot from her. So it's just a real pleasure to be able to introduce her. I'll just tell you a little bit about her background. She's an assistant professor of educational studies at Colgate University. She specializes in philosophy of education, feminist disability studies, and inclusive education. She's interested in gendered and racialized meanings of able-mindedness as they inform epistemic practices in and outside of schools. She writes broadly about the intersections of disability, race, and gender in constructing belonging and participation, inclusive pedagogies and practices that challenge normalcy, and theories and frameworks of institutional inclusion and accessibility. Taylor teaches in educational foundations, disability studies, and women's studies, and offers a praxis course that partners with a local post-secondary program for labeled students to offer collaborative learning and topics related to disabled citizenship and social activism. And her recent publications appear in journals like the Harvard Ed Review, Educational Theories, Studies in Philosophy of Education, Theory and Research in Education, and soon in Philosophical Inquiry in Education. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Ashley, whose talk title today is The Moral Significance of Epistemic Agency intellectual disability and communities of knowers. Ashley.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That's a really lovely introduction. And I should start by saying that Kevin is underplaying the influence that he's had on me as well. So this is really the last couple, especially the last couple of years, the last year where we've been working on some collaborations together have just been really, really great. So before I even begin, I want to just make sure that I made an access copy that I think Angus has circulated in the chat. For those of you who want to follow along, it's just a sort of script of my talk, and I'm not sure if Angus, if it makes sense to send it. Oh, great, you already did. That's great. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So I want to just start by thanking the Center for the Study of Learning and Performance at Concordia, along with Kevin McDonough and David Waddington for inviting me to do this talk today. And I also want to thank Mayra, Angus and Jihan for coordinating. I'm just really happy to be here, whatever that means right now. So I'm just going to give you, I'm going to start, as you can see, the title of my talk is The Moral Significance of Epistemic Agency, Intellectual Disability and Communities of Knowers. And I'm going to start by just giving you a kind of overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So in part one, I'm going to describe what I call a subversively inclusive higher education course. And then in part two, I'm going to talk about how intellectually disabled people are positioned as deficient knowers and how that particular kind of construction showed up in this class that I taught. And then in part three, I'm going to make a case for the moral significance of epistemic agency and close there and look forward to your questions. So to start, I thought it would be important to sort of give some terminology here. So in the talk, I'm exploring intellectual disability as a concept. And many of you will be familiar, sort of whether colloquially or in terms of your practice, with the concept or with the term intellectual disability. And many of you might be familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual categorization of intellectual disability as a developmental disorder. As I really hope will become clear, I don't subscribe to that definition, but I definitely think that that definition plays a significant role in how the concept of intellectual disability has materialized, and something that I'm going to spend some time unpacking today. So I use the terms in the talk labeled with intellectual disability and intellectually disabled interchangeably. And I mean this to capture the sense in which intellectual disability is a concept imposed upon people to make sense of their differences. So part one, a subversively inclusive higher education course. A group of college students arrive at a highly selective college campus on a warm mid-October day. They emerge from a passenger van, 4 young men and a woman, variously dressed in a leather jacket, pink pants, frumpy sweatshirts, and a t-shirt that says label jars, not people. The students walk towards the academic building, greeting people as they go, excitedly entering their new classroom and meeting their classmates. So over the course of a semester, and as these students complete the twice weekly walk through the parking lot and into the hallways of the academic building, down the stairs to their new classroom, they will be read, which is to say, interpreted by their classmates and by passersby as intellectually disabled. Their bodies, their facial features, and their ways of greeting and communicating will all be taken to evidence a marked difference from the campus norm of social engagement, which is to say a norm of able-minded psychological, behavioral, and communicative engagement. And more than simply marking difference, their bodies and their facial features and their ways of greeting and communicating will be taken to evidence their non-belonging in the community of knowers, to which they are, at least physically, entering. The t-shirt therefore contains a message of defiance against the expectations of able-bodied and minded normalcy, against which these labeled students will be regularly measured. So the students I've just described were enrolled in a course that I've taught a couple of times in partnership with a local post-secondary program serving students labeled with intellectual disabilities. So Jessica Bacon and I have recently written an article that describes these courses as subversively inclusive. And we mean this to say that they are intentionally designed to subvert the naturalized exclusion of people labeled as intellectually disabled in higher education. And at the same time, our hope is that these courses will challenge pervasive academic ableism. So in that vein, the course focused on topics of disability, citizenship, and inclusion. And students from the partner organization that I worked with joined students from Colgate for a half semester of coursework. I structure the course to build and facilitate what we might describe as epistemic peerhood, or a kind of epistemic inclusion amongst the participants. So what I mean by this is the sense that not that the non-labeled students are helping the intellectually disabled students to learn, which is often the case in contexts like these, but more so that the students are all learning together in ways that structure their sort of epistemic agency and build the sense in which they are knowers together. So my goal then is to build an inclusive learning community that is simultaneously and subversively an inclusive epistemic community, or an inclusive community of knowers. So to give you kind of like an example of how, one example, very small, of how I did this, when I had the students discussing the concept of crip time, which is a concept from crip theory or disability studies, if you're familiar, that sort of is meant to capture the sense in which disabled people experience their bodies, interact, their bodies or their minds interacting differently with time, or how time is altered or changed in relation to the disabled body. So I asked the students to go around campus and look at things, the way that time is structured on campus. How is time being represented? This is a sculpture that what you're seeing, which is to visually describe it, you're seeing a turning sort of infinity wheel here. This is a sculpture on my campus that the students found and then took a video of, and I made a little GIF of this. I can't take credit for that. I don't know how to make a GIF. One of my students made a GIF for me of this. So this is sort of one of the kinds of examples of the way that, that the students sort of engage in thinking about things like time and what does time mean, which is a core concept in disability studies. Okay, so just so that you don't get dizzy, I'll turn the GIF part off. So the course created a range of opportunities for students to engage across ability differences, and it structured an environment that was aimed at recognizing and cultivating the epistemic agency of intellectually disabled learners as epistemic peers, as I said. So not surprisingly, the course also brought along with it a range of tensions, both for the students and for me as an instructor. And among this was the sort of persistent normalizing force of internalized messages of academic rigor that I experienced as both overwhelming frustration, self-doubt, and anxiety. So teaching within the context of a highly selective, which is a very, I think, very American designation, liberal arts context, served not only to emphasize the outlier status of my labeled students, but also to challenge the very purpose of the course, which was to expand access to higher education opportunity, particularly to students who would not even remotely qualify under the college's admission ranking of selectivity, right, in relation to that specific criteria. So I also spent a lot of time worrying about the students, all right? I worried about whether or not they were getting anything out of the course, whether anyone was being harmed or exploited by it, whether this pedagogical exercise itself was even anti-ableist at all, right? Was I fulfilling that as a practice? And I knew, of course, that teaching is like fraught with ethical dilemmas, right? And this is why many of us find teaching so rewarding. But I was also unprepared for the kinds of ethical dilemmas that the course raised. And they were like numerous and frequently left me feeling like my professional and scholarly training had sort of been insufficient to the task before me, despite having worked in inclusive practice for many years prior to this. So I'm going to give you an example of this that I'm going to speak around for the rest of the talk to kind of give you a sense of one of these ethical dilemmas. So my first time teaching the course, I faced the difficult question of whether and how to discuss a particular historical moment in disability history, And that is the horrific historical treatment of intellectually disabled people and other people labeled with disabilities within institutions, such as Willowbrook Institution, and these are two institutions in the United States, Willowbrook Institution or the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. So here's an image, postcard image of Willowbrook State School, which is located on Staten Island. Some of you might be familiar with it. I don't relish the experience of sharing such a history with students, but I do find it to be a very important and neglected part of North American history, and one that is really important within the disability rights movement and thinking about self-advocacy and disability rights activism. So I wanted to explicitly include conversations about this in the syllabus, including, and this is important, a video that was made by self-advocates, which is to say folks who identify as intellectually disabled and who participate in activism on behalf of intellectually and developmentally disabled people. And the video is called We Have Choices, and there's a new version of it that actually interestingly doesn't include some of the images that I'm about to talk about. But at the time, the video did include these images. And so I wanted to show this video in part because it was made by self-advocates, and that seemed really important. They did include images of neglect at Willowbrook and other state institutions. So right before I was about to show this video to the students, I was asked by my counterpart from the partner organization, so my sort of partner teacher, not to show images of Willowbrook or other institutions because these images would be particularly upsetting for the labeled students in the course. So it's not unusual for teachers to have to make difficult decisions about curricular content, as we know, including ones that raise questions about paternalism and developmental propriety. Although I think it is important to note that the students in the course, the labeled and non-labeled students in the course, were all between the ages of 21 and 26. It's also the case that we often have to make decisions about, particular forms of content and whether or not we're going to include them. But what felt different in this case, and particularly challenging, was that my partner teacher's request explicitly cited the neurological particularities of Down syndrome as a reason against exposure to difficult images, that these images would stick in the minds of those students in ways that might deeply affect their emotional well-being. So I just want to say that I'm actually not sure about this whole terrain of thinking about the ways that questions about how neurology, the relationship between Down syndrome and neurology, I just don't know questions about that. So I don't know how to assess the accuracy of that claim. But it's important for my understanding of this whole, this request, that it suggested that the students were different kinds of knowers relative to visual content. So it might seem like an effective compromise to simply discuss institutionalization, right? Rather than show images of it. But in this case, what's difficult is that the images themselves are actually central to the history. And part of the reason for that is that the images, and the example that you're seeing on the slide is of Christmas in Purgatory, which was a photographic essay that sort of, the expose that revealed some of the conditions in institutions in the United States. That famously Burton Blatt put out in the 1960s. And then in 1972, famously Geraldo Rivera revealed the conditions through another expose within Willowbrook. So in these particular cases, the actual images themselves are part of that history of the deinstitutionalization, the history of the deinstitutionalization movement. And so, and so excluding them would sort of have particular kind of meaning in terms of the images themselves. I'm going to show you an image because I think since I'm referencing it, it's important that I also show you an image from Willowbrook. So this is an image of some intellectually and developmentally disabled, I think it's fair to call them inmates within the institution. You can see people, it's very crowded. You can see people in various stages of dress. And you can also see that there's a woman in the foreground who appears to have some elements of evidence of violence or evidence of physical abuse on her body. So just see where I am here. Lost my spot. Okay, there we go. Okay, so for all these reasons, the decision not to show the images felt like it acquiesced to more than a simple request about the form of content delivery. It in fact felt a little bit like sanitizing the content of the knowledge itself, rather than simply a decision about how to deliver that content. So I want to make it clear, though, that when I'm asking the questions, and as I go forward and sort of asking this question about what ought to have been done, I think it's really important that I say that I am not trying to target the particular teacher here. What I'm interested is in myself as a teacher or my partner teacher and her request. What I'm trying to do is talk through the context of the decision and how that decision comes to seem, what seems salient in that decision. So in the end, I did comply with my partner teacher's request out of respect for her educator authority and to safeguard the relationship with the organization. But I was left with big questions, including the extent to which this decision undermined my students' opportunities to develop epistemic agency. And this brings me to part 2. I'm going to talk a little bit in part 2 about intellectually disabled people as deficient knowers. Constructed as deficient knowers. Okay, so let me say a little bit about how I'm using the concept of epistemic agency. So I'm describing epistemic agency in broad terms, and I intend it to mean substantive and meaningful participation in a community of knowers. So this is a very broad understanding, and you certainly might want, and I think that would be fair, a more fine-grained understanding of what epistemic agency entails. And this is something that I continue to work on in my own work and something that others have taken up in thinking about what could epistemic agency look like outside of expectations of able-mindedness. But I'm wanting to focus here on how the moral significance of epistemic agency as an aim of education is subverted or undermined by the concept of intellectual disability itself. So I'm arguing that the concept of intellectual disability constructs intellectually disabled people as deficient knowers. And without being recognized as a knower or potential epistemic agent in the first place, opportunities to develop epistemic agency, which is to say, develop the abilities to substantively and meaningfully participate in knowledge communities, will be impossible. Okay, so returning to the question of Willowbrook and the images. I think it's fair to say that the appropriate response to the Willowbrook images decision is quite difficult to ascertain. For one thing, it all happened really fast, right? As most of these teaching decisions do. And it was structured by the complexity of my community partnership that I was trying really hard to maintain and felt really important to maintain. And at the same time, this story, I think, also points to significant questions about how intellectual disability is invoked as a concept with epistemic content, and as how the invocation of intellectual disability rationalizes the subversion or deferral of concerns about students' development of epistemic agency. And I'm going to explain more what I mean by that. So taking a step back for a second to better understand how intellectual disability is being invoked in this case, because I think it's being invoked in several ways. So first, I think intellectual disability could be being invoked as an identity. So my partner teacher's claim could have been about referencing the particular historical relationship between intellectual disability identity and particular forms of violence, right? Namely institutionalization. So this isn't a claim about a kind of neurological or biological difference, but instead about an identity difference, right? An historical identity difference. So as many of you probably know, the question of the relationship between students' identities and content learning about histories of violence is really complex. Lots of people work on this, right? But I think it's fair to say that there's a relative consensus that the question is not if students who are members of groups that have experienced histories of violence, right, like Indigenous students or Black students or LGBTQ identified students. The question isn't whether they should have access to the content knowledge. Rather, the question is how and perhaps when developmentally. So we could also have been thinking in this case that intellectual disability is biology. And I think in invoking Down syndrome in particular, as my partner teacher did, that in doing that, she referenced ways of processing information that were particular to people with Down syndrome. And it could therefore be construed as a kind of point about genetically informed forms of processing information, if such a thing exists, rather than, say, cognitive ability. However, Down syndrome is taken to be ontologically like sort of coextensive with intellectual disability, which is another way of saying this, is that they come together. They're thought of as they're understood to be together. So trisomy 21 is understood to cause intellectual disability, trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. So the reference to the particular cognitive processing characteristics of people with Down syndrome is therefore quite difficult to disentangle from intellectual disability. And in this sense, intellectual disability is underscored as a kind of permanent or bodily condition. So another possibility is that intellectual disability is being invoked as a concept. So even while genetic anomalies like trisomy 21 or birth traumas like oxygen deprivation can affect cognitive development, the biomedically defined features of intellectual and cognitive impairment draw on concepts, right? The understanding of intellectual disability as an impairment draws on concepts like intelligence or IQ and social adaptation that strain the credibility that the claim that intellectual impairment, right? It strains the credibility of the claim that intellectual impairment is just reducible to a biological condition. There's way too many sort of social constructs floating around this concept. So instead, intellectual disability is a concept or meaning made about a set of perceived differences, not an entity that can be found out on the body. So in this case, evoking it as a concept is sort of present within this request. And I think the other sense in which the intellectual disability is invoked in this case is as an epistemic concept in particular, which is to say as a concept that embeds particular meanings about knowledge and knowing. So returning to this T-shirt that we began with the slogan labeled "Jars, Not People," wearing this T-shirt is more than an aesthetic choice, right? It's an act of defiance against the everyday strategies of interpretation and sense-making that are used to position those we encounter and on an everyday basis as able or not able, particularly in relation to the kinds of learners or knowers that they are. And these kinds of strategies of interpretation rely on a concept of intellectual disability that leads to particular and overwhelmingly negative conclusions about what a person is capable of. So the T-shirt is kind of like a direct challenge to the concept and to a set of meanings that come with it. So meanings about intellectual inferiority, social ineptness, communicative deficiency, and these are concepts that are like sort of widely and everyday in everyday use that sort of unproblematically position people as lesser knowers. And as a consequence, sideline, if not outright exclude them from knowledge communities, like, for example, the university. So within educational theory, philosophy, and research, it's widely assumed and even sometimes argued that people with intellectual impairments don't participate in research or in scholarly engagement simply because their impairments prevent them from doing so. It's seen as a necessary consequence. So it's actually really rare for colleges and universities to include people labeled with intellectual disabilities among their calls for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And rarer still for colleges and universities to matriculate or hire intellectually disabled people into research or scholarly roles. And there are some exceptions, and I would love to talk about those exceptions in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So a significant factor in this landscape of non-participation is the widely held meaning of the label or diagnosis of intellectual disability as an impaired ability to reason, to engage in abstract thinking, to problem solve, and to navigate contexts of linguistic, conceptual, or creative complexity. So in short, a significant factor is the concept of intellectual disability itself. It appears to not only explain, but also justify the absence of intellectually disabled people within communities of scholarly engagement. So another way to put this is that people labeled with intellectual disabilities are frequently and unproblematically regarded as lesser or deficient knowers in virtue of their disability. That means that intellectual impairment is seen to portend, which is to say expect, or sort of, expect a limited epistemic potential. So it seems that will just be the case, that a person with an intellectual disability will have limited epistemic potential. Put another way, intellectual impairment is conflated with a limitation in a person's ability to contribute to knowledge generating and sharing practices. So this assumption shapes who is taken seriously as a knower and who is expected in communities of knowledge making. So to summarize, a central part of the concept of intellectual disability is that intellectually disabled people are deficient knowers, and that they therefore have diminished potential to develop epistemic agency. So following, I'm trying to think about this through feminist disability studies work, because I think it's helping me to sort of understand the scope and the scale of this problem, of what I'm trying to name. So using Alison Kafer's work, who's a feminist disability studies scholar and crip theorist, she's written about futurity and the construction of disabled people as lacking futures. So we might understand intellectual disability as predicting a kind of negative epistemic futurity, right? So to kind of help make sense of that, I'll read this quote from Alison Kafer from her book, Feminist Queer Crip. The future has been deployed in the service of compulsory able-bodiedness and able-mindedness. Ideas about disability and disabled minds and bodies animate many of our collective evocations about the future. In these imaginings, disability too often serves as the agreed upon limit of our projected futures. So as a concept, intellectual disability implies diminished epistemic futurity, and that it is a natural consequence of intellectual impairment. And this imagined non-futurity makes decisions that potentially threaten students' access to opportunities to develop epistemic agency, right? Like Willow the Burlbrook Images case, makes those instances appear less concerning because they are consistent with intellectually disabled students' imagined epistemic potential. And this brings me to part 3 of the talk, and the last part of the talk, which is the moral significance of epistemic agency. Oh, I went too fast, but I'll leave that up there. So as I explained, the question of whether it was right in my decision, whether I was right in my decision not to show images of Willowbrook to my students is pretty difficult to be sure about. But what I hope is clear by now is that the presence of the concept of intellectual disability itself, that the presence of the concept shapes and constrains that decision-making, including informing what concerns are deemed morally significant and how competing concerns should be weighted. So in the last section then of this talk, I want to spend some time making a case for the moral significance of epistemic agency as a broad and discrete educational aim. So to do that, I'm going to highlight a conceptual intervention that I'm proposing by way of highlighting the constraints that intellectual disability as a concept places on conceptualizing and enacting inclusion. So this conceptual intervention I've named, and I'm sort of unsure about this because it's clunky, so if anyone has better ideas, but I've named this particular conceptual intervention, which is the entanglement of intellectual disability and epistemic futurity or non-futurity as disabled mindedness. So in other words, disabled mindedness is meant to capture this kind of entanglement of these two ideas. So my goal in doing this, in naming this conceptual intervention, is to clarify the space and scope of injustice, which is a project that philosophers have described as ameliorative or inquiry or conceptual ethics. So this is a branch of normative theorizing that considers the normative work that concepts do, in particular how the concepts we use solidify or fix what thoughts we can have about a thing, right? So conceptual ethics places significant emphasis on the conceptual repertoire and its role in enabling and constraining the forms of action that are possible and what entities, ways of being, forms of discourse appear thinkable or relevant in our lives. So Burgess and Plunkett in their 2013 paper, Conceptual Ethics, described the importance of this kind of work really well. So they say that conceptual choices and changes may be intrinsically interesting, but the clearest reason to care about them is just that they're non-conceptual consequences, which is another way of saying they're real world consequences, right? The material consequences are pervasive and profound. So conceptual ethics is concerned with how concepts structure our engagement with the world and both enable and constrain the kinds of practices and conditions and even the kinds of subjects, right? The kind of people that are legible and intelligible. If you're interested, this is similar to what Sally Haslanger has called analytic inquiry in her work. So to take a closer look, the conceptual formation that I'm describing, this intervention that I'm describing as disabled-mindedness, sort of describing this entanglement through this new concept of disabled-mindedness, has several features. To treat someone as disabled-minded is to treat them as globally deficient in their capacity as a knower, and to treat that deficiency as arising from some objectively real fact about that person, rather than as a consequence of their social positioning. Disabled-mindedness also, it enables and rationalizes the treatment of labeled people as outside the community of knowers. And finally, disabled-mindedness creates the foundation for rationalizing educational decisions that deny opportunities for the development of epistemic agency, including by downgrading the moral significance of ensuring that those opportunities exist. So by naming this conceptual formation, my goal is to highlight epistemic considerations within conversations about inclusive practice, and to emphasize the relationship between epistemic agency and pattern forms of structural violence that go beyond epistemic considerations. So I'm going to just close by explaining that a little bit further. So disabled-mindedness is self-reinforcing. It is taken to both explain and justify the exclusion, the epistemic exclusion of people understood as intellectually disabled. So that intellectually disabled people are seen as necessarily and in virtue of their disability, impaired in their ability to contribute to knowledge generation and sharing, then educational practice and decisions that deny them opportunities to develop epistemic agency are therefore normatively muted, which is another way of saying that, is that they take on less significance. According to this logic, the moral significance of epistemic agency can be easily and justifiably subverted to other concerns, such as labeled students' present emotional well-being or their epistemic needs, or the epistemic needs of their non-disabled counterparts. So I want to make it clear that what I'm not saying is that emotional well-being is not important, right? I think what emotional well-being is extremely important, care a lot about my students' emotional well-being. But practices of social and academic protectionism are ready tools for epistemic exclusion. And discourses and rationales of protectionism are one of the reasons why intellectually disabled people were warehoused in institutions like Willowbrook in the first place. But the stakes of the structural denial of epistemic futurity to intellectually disabled people does actually go beyond the classroom. It goes beyond this kind of the classroom practices of developing epistemic agency. Disabled-mindedness both operates as a rationale for structural forms of violence and positions people regarded as intellectually disabled as the targets of violence. So importantly, this entanglement, this conceptual entanglement of intellectual disability and epistemic non-futurity or disabled-mindedness is a ready vehicle for the perpetuation of racist epistemic practices. This is just one example, including practices of labeling and disciplining that relegate BIPOC students to renewed forms of racial segregation via special education. So in short, the undermining of persons and their capacities as knowers has significant downstream consequences for their social, for their moral and political belonging. And to put it really plainly, there's an important connection between the treatment of members of a group as deficient knowers and their treatment, and the treatment of them as subjects unworthy of just care, right, of justice. So Jose Medina, who's written about epistemic injustice, I'm going to read this quote from him because I think it helps to explain this. So social injustices breed epistemic injustices, or rather, these two kinds of injustices are two sides of the same coin, always going together, being mutually supportive and reinforcing each other. So here Medina is describing epistemic injustices as social pathologies of recognition, because they undermine a person's status as a knower or their relation, because undermining a person's status as a knower, right, or their relationship to knowledge results in their group's diminished recognition or their misrecognition in broader society. So being regarded as a deficient knower has impairing consequences for morals and civic standing, and this diminished status can render one vulnerable to physical, cultural, and structural forms of violence. And here, I don't think I need to point any further than to reference triage decision-making during the early and ongoing stages of the pandemic, and also current decision-making about vaccination and congregate care. So to summarize and close, people labeled with intellectual disabilities are frequently regarded as deficient knowers and as lacking epistemic futurity. As a result, epistemic agency can be readily subverted or deferred within educational contexts, structured as they are by persistent epistemic ableism. However, substantive and meaningful opportunities to develop epistemic agency are actually necessary for not only for ensuring that intellectually disabled people have access to meaningful learning, but to ensure that they play a substantive role in shaping social meanings. And because the stakes of epistemic exclusion include its relationship to material violence, epistemic agency must be given, I think, increased and even maybe priority consideration within educational research and practice. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A and our conversation.
Thanks, Ashley. I guess I'll step in here and just remind people that we are asking them to use the Q&A function to raise their questions. Is that right, Jihan and Angus?
Correct. Ashley, you can see the questions when they pop out in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think yeah. Oh, wait, there's two. Oh, okay.
So Jihan, maybe you can help me out here. Can we allow people to ask their own questions, or
yes,
does
Angus
one of us have to read it up?
Angus will help us do that.
All right, thanks.
Oh, yes, stop sharing the screen. Yeah, I'm doing that right now. Thank you.
Until we do that, Ashley, would you like to start with the second question?
Sure, just let me sort my screens out here. I'm trying to get the Q&A on the other screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, sure. Okay, so should I read it out is yes, that what we're doing? Okay. Amesha, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, says, I was wondering how the non-labeled students understood the presence of labeled students, Did you witness this projected disable-mindedness, this erasure of the labeled students as capable of meaning making from the non-labeled students as well? And how did the learning community reinforce or challenge this denial of epistemic agency? That is such a great question. Thank you, Amesha, so much for that. Yeah, so I think the answer to the question is yes, they did participate in this kind of erasure, as you describe it nicely, but also they resisted it. So there's this sort of interesting, I've tried to think a lot about this in relation to, all right, so to step back, I have a lot of data where the non-labeled students talk about, or their journal entries sort of talk about how they were making meaning of the course. And one of the things that I've noticed in sort of analyzing those journal entries is that they spend a lot of time trying to resist their own ways of constructing intellectually disabled students as non-knowers. So, but they also do it. So I'll give you an example I'll give you one example that I think actually really is a good one for this. So the students were, this is the second time I taught the class, the students were working on a group project. And it just so happened in this particular case, because of the numbers, that there were 4 regularly matriculated non-labeled students from Colgate in the class. And there was 1 student who was labeled with intellectual disability in that group. So you had, it was 3 and 1. They were really struggling with how to work on the project together. In particular, there were instances in which the labeled student would end up in tears because she didn't understand what was going on. And so in that case, the students who were the non-labeled students came to me separately and said, we're feeling like really worried about the effect that we're having on our classmate. We feel like we're not doing this right. And that was an instance where the advice I gave them was to take a step back and think about how you're working together to sort through, like, not even like doing the task of the project, but like, how are you actually thinking about sharing space and making sure that everyone's brought along together? And so in the end, they ended up focusing their project just on sort of like how to work together. So in that case, I think that the students in that group all of the students in that group grew a lot from that experience. In the end, I think it made the labeled student feel much more competent. And it also, I think, made the non-labeled students have to take a step back from thinking about like how to do things quickly and efficiently in this way that they're often trained to do, especially in a very competitive academic context like the one in which I work. So a lot of the non-labeled students wrote about how it forced them to really confront their desire to have things done quickly and with speed, which, you know, is an important thing to learn. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. Should I just move to the next question?
Yeah, I think Madeline, you are allowed to talk now. So can you please ask your question to Professor Taylor?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much. That was such a great talk and I learned a great deal from it. Thank you. I teach in the Disability Studies program at King's University College in London, Ontario. And we are a few years into a similar endeavor where we have labeled and non-labeled students together in a course, and we are working on how to grow that program. So everything you said was so helpful, and I'm hopeful we can be more collaborative and learn more from you in the future. But I have a specific, I don't know if it's a question so much as just a reflection on some of the experience that I've had. I've done a lot of work with institutional survivors and their experiences of living in institutions. And I've done a number of workshops and classes where survivors have come into the classroom to speak with non-labeled students about their experiences of living in an institution and what it was like there and what it was like to then be deinstitutionalized and what their lives have been like since then. And so just thinking when you were speaking about this dilemma that you were placed in around what images to show the students and the labeled and non-labeled students around institutional histories. What has been interesting for me in welcoming institutional survivors into the classroom is they are sharing, sometimes with images, their own images that they have, and sometimes without images, their own histories and their own stories of what it was like to live in the institutions. And the turning of the table, so to speak, from the normal educational setting has been really profoundly powerful, in that so many of the non-labeled, non-disabled, per se, students are stunned, and they can't believe that peers, an older generation actually, but that people who live in their neighborhood or sort of in the same city would have gone through this, and that they didn't already know about this. And so it's just, anyway, it's been really interesting for me as an educator to witness this reversal of teaching roles, and how then the question of what do we protect people from or expose people to is changed when the person who's sharing it actually lived it. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, there's a preparation around, okay, we're going to talk about some really difficult stuff today, and so is going to share a story that might make some of us feel uncomfortable. So there's all that kind of prep first. But it's just really, it just is different when we've got the people who've experienced it actually sharing it. And I feel like it's kind of removed some of those dilemmas in a way, or change those ethical questions. Anyway, just thought I'd share that, and wondered if you have anything to say about that or share about that.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I mean, I would love to talk more with you about what you're doing and learn from what you're doing. So maybe I'll reach out after later after the talk. But yeah, I mean, that's great. I think I've also invited self-advocates into my class, although I've not had self-advocates who in this particular class who were institutionalized. I don't know if you're familiar. Michael Kennedy wrote a book that I can't remember the name of. He's American. He's actually local in Syracuse, New York, local to me. He's written a book about surviving institutions. So he is an institutional survivor, and his book came out between the courses. It's the first and the second time I taught it, and I actually made the decision I wanted to teach it in the second iteration, and I made the decision not to, in part because of fear about content. And I think that was a mistake, or at least I think that was a mistake. But I really take your point to be about maybe sort of pushing on this question of form a little bit, but also maybe reminding us to kind of situate, how do I put this? To situate the question in like, what are the kinds of ways that assumptions about form of delivery get those kinds of ideas about disabled-mindedness sort of creep into them. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a complicated question. Mm-hmm. But I really appreciate it, and thank you. And I want to think more through this and reach out to you and talk with you more.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mo.
Thank you. We have a question now from Kara. Kara, you can go ahead.
Am I unmuted now? I think so. Yes. I guess I am really interested in what it means for the person who was working with the students who were labeled to be told to have it said that there was a neurological difference in how these students were processing. Sorry, I'm not speaking very well because this is intimidating. A neurological difference in how they were processing these images. And it makes me think, why would the processing of images be associated with able-mindedness, whereas the difference be potentially associated with a particular labeled disability? And I guess it makes me wonder what might this feedback about how we neurologically take in images, how might that influence you when you teach the class in the future for any group of students? And how might there be spaces in classes for students to say, I'm processing this information really differently, when they can say it, And then what does it look like when a student might need additional advocacy? So I just was really interested in that whole little scene.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Kara. Thank you. I one of the things that I've sort of, I didn't say, but I'm kind of interested in is the question of why, instead of thinking about, so like in that instance, I think the appropriate thing to do might be, is to think really like carefully about how do you scaffold the relationship to images. And I think this goes back to something Madeline was saying too, right? That the question is not if you show them, it's how you show them. And maybe, I mean, maybe it is if you show them, but I think that the first point is to say, is the decision, how is the decision to show or not to show being informed by assumptions about this person's ability to know and what kind of a knower they are? And then I think what you're asking is really pointing to, like, to what extent does scaffolding that relationship to the images, how does that look similar to how we might think about scaffolding in general, right? So like one thing that strikes me as really important is that I mean, whenever I talk about really difficult histories of violence with students and maybe even think about showing images, any kind of student, whether it's a racial violence, whether it's a gender violence, whether it's an ability violence, I think carefully about how I scaffold that. And part of the reason for showing this particular video was because it did that, because the self-advocates talked about that in the video. But I think that it still sort of raises this question of like, to what extent is that decision not only about if, but also about how being structured by an assumption about the kinds of knowers and intellectually disabled people are? Does that answer your question at all?
I mean, I think it was an interesting response. So yes, I think it did.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Kara.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Taylor. We have one more question in the Q&A feature.
From the anonymous attendee, I think.
Yes.
Yes. Do you see a difference between age groups when it comes to perceptions of epistemic disability? And are perceived differences just ingrained in younger generations? Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, this is hard. I don't know how to answer the question from my own experience. And part of the reason is that my only experience with the age groups is with adult learners in university context. So that's hard for me to answer. I think that the question maybe in the back of that question is a kind of question about like how younger students interact differently with disability and sort of make sense of disability differently. And part of that is because they haven't had as long to sort of be infected by ableism. I don't know how else to put that. There's a lot of really interesting literature on that in disability studies and education, but I don't know if I could speak to that question, but I appreciate it a lot.
Hi, Ashley. I think I have permission from Angus to step in and ask a question of my own. And I think it ties to Kara's question, but the background to the question is that I recently had an interaction with another philosopher about, epistemic agency and the label of knower, right? Which I'd always sort of seen as synonymous or roughly equivalent.
Right.
And I don't know if you had shared that sense or if you made a distinction between the two. But anyway, the interaction was, basically, people with intellectual disabilities have epistemic agency, but skepticism about whether they could be properly labeled or classified as knowers. And the reason was, I think, that the label or the concept of a knower implies sort of justification sorts of requirements, right? That sort of like a specific set of reasoning skills that pertain to the ability to sort of justify beliefs, right? Yeah. And so basically the idea was, well, epistemic agency, yes, but not to the, for at least, many people with intellectual disabilities, it's questionable whether one can legitimately sort of say that they rise to the status of knowers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your example in the talk about, the sort of, your reflections on the ethical complexities of showing the images of institutional images to people with Down syndrome sort of helps me understand why I think that's an important issue. And I'm interested in what you're thinking, what your thinking might be, just simply because, I mean, it seems like the concern, tell me if I'm wrong, the concern in your case was, grounded in an assumption that the viewers of the images do have some sort of epistemic agency, right? How can you be traumatized by images unless you have some capacity, epistemic capacity, right? But
Right.
that, they lacked the necessary capacities of knowers to kind of make proper sense of those images or to sort of resolve them in a way that would be, sort of rectify the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So does that sound like a reasonable interpretation of what was going on there? That it's more about the concerns that you're raising are more about how we think of people labeled with intellectual disabilities as knowers in a way than it is about their abilities or capacities as epistemic agents.
Yeah, that's okay. That's really helpful. And actually, like, this is sort of fun because this is something that you and I have talked about only a little bit, but we also got asked recently to think about the difference between epistemic subject and epistemic agency in a recent talk that we gave. So yeah, this is helpful. And I've been trying to think, I guess I have a lot of thoughts about that, but the first one is to sort of, I've been thinking about this difference between epistemic agent and epistemic subject a little bit. And I sort of feel like I think like the way that one might define epistemic subject is like just someone who can know things, right? Or someone who, right, like you said, like you can't be traumatized by something unless you, right? Whereas an epistemic agent is someone who has the ability to sort of influence and participate in and be engaged within a knowledge community. And I think this is why I think this has helped me to really make sense of why I'm interested in epistemic agency. And the reason why is because I think that it matters that a person not only be sort of seen as like knowing things, but they be seen as knowing things that have an effect that, how do I put this? Knowing things that others should take seriously. In other words, that knowing things that matter and should matter to other people. And so I think like whenever I think about defining epistemic agency, part of the trouble is that, as you point out, within philosophical work, the definitions of epistemic agency that exist, just for the most part, with exceptions, just do not make it possible to conceive of many intellectually disabled people as possible epistemic agents. So that's a problem with how epistemic agency, as you all know, right, is defined in very much in terms of able-mindedness. But it seems also really important to me that the extent to which a person experiences epistemic agency is going to be structured by how the community of knowers engages with them. So it's both a sort of community and collaborative and relational practice. And so I think that's why I tend to be like interested in sort of discrete kinds of communities like the classroom, right? And sort of like trying to use those as cases to extrapolate, like this particular course, to extrapolate to make sense of like, what would agency look like in this? Is this context manifesting agency, and how so? And what are the ways that agency is being constrained in part of that by the concepts of intellectual disability that are floating around? Does that answer the question, Kevin?
Well, I mean, it certainly, contributes to my sort of understanding of the problem that I think we're sort of wrestling with. I think what it points to is the necessity of kind of, maybe in your work and in our work and just in general in this sort of philosophical work to tackle, both the concept of a knower and of epistemic agency, and to
Yes.
sort of see that they're different, and that there may be some complexities there that that would be useful in just shedding light on the kinds of issues that you're talking about. But I think Jessica Harless might have a question, so thanks very much for your
thank you.
response.
And just to say really quickly, I think that that being regarded as a knower is a precondition for being given being granted or being having epistemic agency structured. I think that's the case, and yeah, we'll discuss more shortly. Hi, Jessica.
Hey, Ashley.
Hi.
Thanks. This is really cool work, and I am thinking a little bit about you had a couple of brief comments toward the end about protectionism. And I'm thinking about that because I can feel a connection or a little tickle to my concerns about the stuff I'm doing around safe space and speech and practices, decisions in a classroom that have to do with that. And I think there are some really neat connections here. And I've been thinking a lot about the idea of protectionism and what it means for an instructor to try to make those decisions and those choices. As you described really well in your vignette, kind of like in the moment, really quickly, you can't even tell like what's up, what's down, to try to sort out that choice. And I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean for the actual participants, for the community itself, to try to make those choices, to be agents about and either consent to or make their own decision about what sorts of content and material, what sorts of ways they want to interact with content or engage with the ideas of the course. I'm just wondering if you see any lines through to that kind of move in that moment.
Yeah, so particularly thinking about this question of like, what would it mean to give students more actual agency in
Sure.
Yeah. Whew. It's really, I guess the way I want to answer the question is by saying, when I was thinking about writing about this case, I only just have started to realize how many intersections there are with these kinds of questions about, like you say, safe space and speech. And maybe that's surprising that it took me that long to sort of figure it out. But I think this is a really good question. My thought in this case is like one of the challenges here is that I'm trying to be careful about how I say this, but the organization, the partner organization that I work with, they gave me a lot of latitude in terms of how I ran the course, like just total latitude, basically, except in these particular kinds of discrete instances. So I think like in some ways, the challenge was it felt like it was my decision, but it also didn't feel like it was my decision. Mm-hmm. And I think that made the question of what was right in that instance really hard to know, in addition to all the other things that I said. But ideally, I think it would be wonderful to create contexts in which students could not only think about what kinds of content they want to be exposed to and think through together, but also to be able to generate and come up with the content itself, right? One of the things that would be really amazing and that I think would be a really neat project and maybe one to pursue in the future is to develop a curriculum with self-advocates, right? To develop a curriculum around and in part to develop a curriculum that wasn't just about the content, but was about the pedagogy, right? Which I think is what you were asking about, which is this question of, right? So what would that look like? What would a course that was designed pedagogically and curricularly by self-advocates, by folks who identify as intellectually disabled? And I think like one of the questions that the case is making me think about as I continue to write about it and think about it, is like, how might my colleagues, in self-advocacy organizations, which is to say folks in the self-advocacy organizations that are local and who I work with, how would they want me to do that, right? And it's not like they're the students in the class. They're obviously very different, but they have a relationship to this knowledge that's very different than the relationship I have to the knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about it, because I think those intersections with safe space and speech are really complicated, especially, and I think this goes back to Kara's question, if we think about like how can we formulate our questions about this in a way that resists this kind of subverting of the moral significance of epistemic agency, right? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to see you, sort of, not really, through the Zoom.
Thank you so much. We have one last question from Lynn.
Great. Lynn. Hi, Lynn. Great to see you, Lynn.
Hello. I finally saw where I can unmute myself. Well, big thank you, Ashley. It's always a pleasure to witness how you feel for students and anyone in your care. So I just want to bring back an important aspect that you yourself and Kevin addressed at more length during PES about the diverse knowers themselves. How do they see themselves? How much can scholars, researchers give them consciously and purposefully, by Dewey's cliche, participation in academic discourse, their voices? Because if you're not in somebody else's shoes, you may construct and deconstruct them all you like. No matter how compassionately, how carefully you listen, you're still not in their skin, still not in their mind and body. And I was wondering about the challenges of neurodiversity. In some cases, we cannot assume that they, and I'm one of them also, so they are less than always passively harmless, sitting in the corner and waiting to be analyzed and helped. We have to recognize that sometimes diversity, neurophysiological diversity, can be very hurtful and very difficult for people around the person experiencing and embodying. So it's an uphill climbing project to relate to one another. And I was also thinking about defining knowers, anything epistemic, anything moral, anything of value in life. It happens with indigenous people, it happens across cultures. What is considered a knower, those that this person in a smaller community can be recognized as such, valued, highly regarded even, may look different from a different paradigm. So it's also a question of different paradigms.
Thank you, Lynn. I want to say like yes to everything that you just said, because I think what you just described is the importance of this question of who has the power to define. And I think that what I think you're saying, what I hope that I hope that the talk sort of gave was like, that's kind of the core, the heart, at the heart of the project is to ask the question of like, what are the assumptions about who has the power to define, right? And what are the sort of substantive ways that opportunities to define are created, right? Especially for folks who experience such, as people who are labeled with intellectual disabilities in particular, though not exclusively, experience such sidelining within communities of knowledge making, or as being seen as people who have meaning to contribute to the world. So I just appreciate what you said, because I hope that I'm sort of getting at I hope I'm speaking to what you said, but it reminded me of this question of who has the power to define.
Totally. In your experience, have you come across a student of yours who has said, I am different, I'm looked down upon, but this is what I think, and I am a thinker. This is what I'm inviting.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. And I think in some ways that's what that t-shirt is saying too, right? Like the label jars not people is this kind of moment of saying, I'm defining for myself against what you're doing. Yeah. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks, Ashley. I'm getting messages saying that our time is up and we need to to wrap it up. But just wanted to thank you again for a great talk, and thank everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone,
for coming and for the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really wonderful.